Hey everybody, Professor Recore here. Let's go ahead and get started with the lab from this past Wednesday. Okay, so we haven't talked about the brain ventricles before, so let's talk about them now. So first, we want to make sure that we specify the four brain regions, being the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. Now, inside these regions, there's these fluid-filled spaces that are referred to as the ventricles. And inside the ventricles flows this stuff called cerebrospinal fluid, which we're going to talk more about in the lecture in this coming week. But the cerebrospinal fluid is generated by these cells called the ependymal cells, which are found within the choroid plexuses. And if you look at the picture here in the middle, sort of from top to bottom, so our beginning point is in the lateral ventricles. Then the cerebrospinal fluid will flow through the interventricular foramen. At this point, it'll be in the third ventricle. Moving through the third ventricle, it then traverses this thing called the cerebral aqueduct, or the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius, at which point it's in the fourth ventricle. And after it descends inferior to that, it'll pass through the central canal and be down into the spinal column region. Now, being after it leaves the ventricles of the brain, the cerebrospinal fluid is going to be flowing in a place called the subarachnoid space. So recall that our meninges from superficial to deep are the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. So the subarachnoid space, by definition, will be the space that exists between the arachnoid and the pia mater. So that's where cerebrospinal fluid is flowing. If you've ever heard of a procedure called a lumbar tap or a spinal tap, that's when the doctor inserts a needle into that subarachnoid space in order to aspirate some cerebrospinal fluid to see if there's an infection, do a number of tests. Inflammation of the meninges is referred to as meningitis. The arachnoid villi. So I know most of you are pretty familiar with the concept that villi and microvilli job is responsible for absorption. And in this case, it's no different. The arachnoid villi is really important for reabsorbing cerebrospinal fluid, at which point it puts it back into the venous side of the circulation, specifically into the dural venous sinus. If there's some kind of problem with this, that's going to quickly lead to issues because remember that the choroid plexuses are constantly making more cerebrospinal fluid, and so if we're not able to drain the old cerebrospinal fluid, pressure is going to quickly build up from having a larger than normal amount of CSF within our subarachnoid space. So again, the dura mater is the most superficial layer of the meninges. That's Latin. It literally means tough mother. Next is the arachnoid mater, and beneath that is the subarachnoid space. And then the deepest layer of the deepest meninx is the pia mater, which tightly hugs the brain. Okay, I think we might have talked about this just very briefly before, but we're going to be getting a lot heavier into the cranial nerves now that we're in block 4. And there are 12 of them, 12 cranial nerves. And we're going to talk about each one of them in lecture as well as in lab and sort of what their jobs are. So cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve that's responsible for smell. These are the olfactory bulbs, what you see right here. Cranial nerve 2 is the optic nerve. Um, Cranial nerve 3 is the oculomotor nerve. Um, that gives us eye movement as well as a parasympathetic input for pupil reflex. And so everybody, I want you to try to think the parasympathetic input to the pupil. Is that going to dilate the pupil or constrict the pupil? Cranial nerve 4 is the trochlear nerve. That's an eye movement nerve that seems like it belongs with cranial nerve 3, but it winds up getting its own cranial nerve. Same thing for the abducens nerve, cranial nerve 6. Cranial nerve 5 is the trigeminal nerve. It has 3 subdivisions: the optomic, the maxillary, and the mandibular, which we're going to talk more about in the lecture. But sensory innervation to the face as well as chewing are some of the functions for the cranial nerve 5. Mentioned cranial nerve 6 is the abducens nerve. Cranial nerve 7 is the facial nerve. Now, y'all recall us talking about all the different unique facial movements that we're able to make as human beings, which are a big part of why we have so many different unique facial muscles. And they receive dedicated innervation from the facial nerve. But not to be outdone, the facial nerve also contributes to some special sensory fibers that give the tongue its specific taste sensations on the taste buds. That's 7. So cranial nerve 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. That's doing 2 things. That's hearing and balance. The cochlear is the hearing part, and the vestibule is the balance. Balance, and another way of saying it would be proprioception, which is an intuitive sense of your position in space. That makes sense. Cranial nerve 9 is going to be the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is going to be the vagus nerve is cranial nerve 10. The vagus nerve really has its fingers in a lot of cookie jars. What I mean by that is that the vagus nerve extends down lower than any other cranial nerve because it really gives out a lot of parasympathetic input to our visceral organs as well as some others. Also some movement and sensation. Cranial nerve 11 is, they renamed it. So when I first learned it, it was the spinal accessory nerve. Now they just call it the accessory nerve. But cranial nerve 11 is going to be a nerve that innervates our trapezius muscle, as well as the sternocleidomastoid. So when we shrug our shoulders, we're able to do that because of the accessory. And then the hypoglossal nerve, which that is the nerve that innervates the glossus muscles in the neck for swallowing. Also, it gives some motor control to the tongue for moving, as well as sensation, but not taste bud sensation like touch to the tongue, pressure on the tongue. I can't wait for us to do the sheep brain this week. That's going to be a lot of fun. I'll go over all this whenever we're looking at the sheep brain live, or not live, but you know what I mean. Okay. Back to some older stuff. Bones of the upper extremity. So we're first looking at the humerus. And the first thing that we want to do is to orient ourselves. Now, luckily, there are 2 very distinct ends of the humerus. One of them is clearly the part that should be going into our scapula as being part of that ball and socket joint. It's very ball looking, the head and the neck. And then the part with the epicondyle, the medial and lateral epicondyle, of course, that's going to be at the elbow region. Remember that I told you guys that lateral epicondylitis, that's tennis elbow. Medial epicondylitis, that's golfer's elbow. And of course, even though it's not, I can't see it on here. Uh, I know that y'all will be able to identify the radial groove uh, and impress all the faculty at Tarrant College that y'all know about the nerve structure and the humors. The radius and the ulna. Now, the first thing I want to draw your attention to, guys, is here on the left, okay? Underneath the trochlear notch, it says coronoid process. Don't get that confused with the coracoid process because they sound really similar. And remember, the coracoid process is right here in the front of our shoulder. Now, orienting ourselves, looking at the radius and the ulna, one of the uh, one of the anatomical ways that we can quickly get our heads wrapped around what's what if we don't have the benefit of having it labeled for us is that the radius is going to be thicker at the wrist and the ulna is going to be thicker at the elbow. The and then if you look at the ulna in its posterior view, that back marking, that's the elbow that you're familiar with. That's the olecranon, just the scientific name for it. Um, I'm not going to spend too much time on the carpal bones. I know y'all have decided on the mnemonic that you prefer the best, and I feel pretty good about how well y'all know that. Just want to make sure I remind you about the one unique digit on the hands as well as on the feet, which is digit number 1, and it's missing a middle phalanx. So that's why we have uh, 3, 6, 9, 12, 14 uh, phalanx bones or phalanges on each hand and not 15. So it's not just 5 times 3 because one of those phalanxes doesn't have a middle middle phalanx. I'm sorry. So here on this animation or drawing rather, you see where that scapular coracoid process is, and the acromion is further to the back. I know that they didn't give us a picture that is missing the annular. Oh, there it is. Okay, boy. All right. So if y'all look to the right hand side, it took me forever to find that. The annular ligament of the radius. Remember that nursemaid's elbow that we talked about? Parent yanks their child up, off of the sidewalk to get out of the street or whatever, and especially younger children, it has a tendency to get dislocated because that annular ligament of the radius helps hold the radius and the ulna together at its most proximal portion, and it can get stretched and become dislocated. Our muscle, okay, so muscles of the upper extremity. So we know that our flexors, our elbow flexors, are going to be our biceps brachii, and assisted by the brachialis. Those muscles are innervated by the musculocutaneous nerve. It's antagonized by the triceps brachii on the posterior aspect, which extends the elbow. The muscles on the anterior compartment of the forearm will flex the wrist and also have some digit flexion as well. Likewise, the muscles on the posterior aspect of the forearm will extend the wrist and assist in extending the fingers. And then the intrinsic hand muscles will do some flexion and extension, as well as some of those unique movements like abduction. And then, of course, the lumbricals and the interossei will allow us to adduct and abduct our individual digits. Recall that we had one of our clicker questions was to pick the one that doesn't that isn't involved in flexing the fingers, and the answer was a flexor carpi ulnaris. And the way that we would identify it is it tells us flexor carpi. That tells us that what's being flexed is the carpal region, which is the wrist, instead of, for example, the flexor digitorum, which would be a digit flexion. Okay, that's all of the stuff for the previous lab. Again, I apologize for making you wait until this weekend. I hope this walkthrough was helpful. As always, please feel free to send me any questions that you have, and I'll get back with you super fast. Thanks, y'all. Have a great weekend.